folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette. This is episode 109 of the Podcast Digest. Thank you guys very much for checking out the episode last week. Got a lot of great feedback on it. Hope you guys enjoyed my conversation with Danny Pena from Gamertag Radio. Great conversation on the longer end of what my typical episode length is, and I think you guys probably heard that come through. I was just having a great time sort of reminiscing, going down, the nostalgia path with Danny on old video game stuff and how he accomplished all that he has in this world. So if you, for some reason, are just joining me this week and didn't have a chance to hear that conversation, please go back and check that out. But let's get to this week's show. This is another great one and very timely. If you're listening to this on release day, you guys know by now, release on Sundays. Today is September 25th, but if you're listening anytime this week, this is a big week in the podcast world for one specific day. It's International Podcast Day, September 30th, every single year, and I have with me not just the co-founder of International Podcast Day, but of course a podcaster himself. He's a host of Waves of Tech and a member of the Modern Life Podcast Network. Very pleased to be joined, actually technically, trivia buffs will know, for the second time on the Podcast Digest, by Dave Lee. Dave, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me on. Always enjoy the show. Keep up on everything that you're doing there, and appreciate you having me on to talk a little podcasting, talk a little International Podcast Day, and appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
And it's overdue, to be honest with you, and so I probably need to begin with apologies, because I should have done this last year, even the year before, but International Podcast Day has grown and grown and grown, and we had the opportunity, as I have with so many of my recent guests, to meet in person, first time in Chicago in July, and that is the trivia part of my reference earlier, folks. Dave was one of my five-minute interviews on my episode 100, so I wanted to bring him back to talk about the big upcoming event. So here we go.
Yeah, that was a great little time we had in Podcast Movement. I was excited that you're able to that we were able to meet up. You obviously slot in a little 5-minute interview in the hallways of PM16. It was great to catch up, and appreciate you having me back on.
Yeah, it's about all you can do, right? In terms of
exactly.
In there, a lot of people recording everybody else all the time, and you don't want to ask anyone really for much more than 5 minutes, right? Because there's so much going on at the conference, and
many people passing by that you want to talk to, so many people you plan to meet up with, and 5 minutes is it's golden, but it was good to connect.
So we're going to jump into International Podcast Day. Obviously, a ton of stuff to talk about, but before we do that, I've met you in person. Most of the people listening haven't. So before we get into International Podcast Day, as well as sort of your participation in audio altogether, let's go back even before those days. Tell folks a little bit about yourself, Dave, maybe where you grew up, sort of what you do for work, and Give us the early days of Dave Lee.
Hey, not a problem. Yeah, I was born an Air Force brat. My dad was in the Air Force, retired actually 21 years after service. And so I bounced around just to a couple air bases as growing up. I was actually born in Maine, and then my parents were stationed. My dad was stationed over in Guam, so that's where my sister was. And then he got shipped off to Edwards Air Force Base, which is out here in the Mojave Desert of California. And so, I spent most of my years at Edwards Air Force Base, kicking around the dirt and, playing across the street in the schoolyard and running around to the candy stores. And after my dad retired, we moved up into a small little mountain community in California called Tehachapi, and that's where I went to high school. So I graduated from there. I moved down to where I am at currently, which is Bakersfield, California. It's it's a pretty large city. I believe it's the 9th largest in the state of California. And I moved down here because I actually got a job with the county, the local municipality that's down here, and I decided, hey, man, I need to go to school. So I went to our local university, Cal State University, Bakersfield, picked up my bachelor's and master's degree in public policy and administration, and really just found my niche there. And so currently I'm working in the field of waste management, helping out with the permitting and operational components of landfilling, recycling, a lot of those different things. And so that's sort of a real brief history on who I am. Great news. I got married March of this year, and so that was so great. And then, as we mentioned at the top of the show, my house just sold today, so I'm down to one mortgage payment, and so we're sitting happy and sitting pretty right now. So it's been a fun ride. I've gone through the Air Force and the military lifestyle, and that sort of branded me as I am today. And then jumping into the podcasting space was something that was very unexpected for me, and also my father, who I actually podcast with. So yeah, I think all in all, I'm very thankful for where I'm at and where we've been going with everything. So that's a little bit of my background.
Well, that's awesome. And you know what's funny is that longtime listeners of the show would know from my little corner of the independent world, if you will. There's a couple of people out there by the name of Dave Meyer and Paul Meyer. They are have a show called Diamond Dave Show, and they also did a couple others as well together. And separate Diamond Minds was the father-son show. And when that show launched a little while ago, a year and a half or so ago, there was a kind of reaction to how cool it was to hear a father and son talk. And it was not long thereafter then I came across what you and your dad was doing and realized, hey, look, there's another father-son kind of collaboration going on in the podcasting space. So let's start there in the audio world. How did you / your dad start this whole audio adventure?
Yeah, I enjoy it. I call it podcasting with pops, and that's really what we do week in and week out. Every Monday we record our show called The Waves of Tech. It was interesting again how it started because my dad was living in the town of Tehachapi, and he picked up a new job a little bit north up in Chico, California, and so he moved up there. That's about 5 to 6 hours north from where me and my older brother are actually living right now here in Bakersfield. And so just to simply keep in touch, instead of getting on the phone and talking, we would just load up Skype, and my dad, he would call in, I would join, my brother would join, and we would just kind of shoot back and forth the conversation, talking about life, work, a lot of those different things. And inevitably the conversation always turned to technology. My dad owns an IT company, my brother works in network infrastructure and for a local oil company here within the IT space, and I was sort of that floater guy. I wasn't too much into tech. I still had my flip phone at the time. This was around 2008, and so I was sort of that comedic relief. I really didn't know much about technology, the infrastructure, the business of tech, whatever it was. And so one day my dad just decided, hey guys, I've been hearing about this cool thing called podcast. And he sent us a couple shows. He goes, let's do this. And so what started as just a father and two of his sons connecting on Skype eventually turned into this weekly show. And we eventually built up that show. We are currently at we just recorded episode 324 a couple weeks ago, and it's been an amazing ride. We've gone through so many different iterations of it, format, style, co-host. My brother used to podcast with me, and then he got busy and dropped out. We invited some different people from Florida, and so that's sort of like the origins and the birth of the Waves of Tech, and that eventually grew into my dad really enjoying managing and producing and editing all these podcasts now, where he's grown into his own network, as you mentioned at the top of the show, modernlifepodcastnetwork.com, where he manages and produces about 10 shows on our network. So I really enjoy it. It's a very interesting dynamic. It's, people always ask, what's it like podcasting with your dad or podcasting with family? And I think it's fantastic. It's a great way to connect week in and week out. I do hear a lot of, friends and family and brothers and sisters, moms and dads that say, I wish I could connect more with my kids. And we found that one thing that we can talk about week in and week out, and we always enjoy it. And, so, jumping the gun here a little bit, but when he decided to discuss International Podcast Day, that was without question that him and I start to birth that and bring that to light. And so everything that we've done within the podcasting space, I have to give credit to him for getting me into it, teaching me the technology and the tools. But then just to take that and roll with it, it's an awesome opportunity. I know a lot of people don't have that chance to connect with their parents week in and week out, and I find that to be very rewarding as part of the process.
Well, it sounds like to me that not only is it just kind of catching up and talking, which is probably, like you described, how it began, but when you guys decided to make a show out of it, now it's almost like you're both working on a project, right? You're getting together every week and both working towards a similar aim, right? Imagine assembling show notes, choosing topics, and all of a sudden it's like you guys are quote unquote working together towards something. And with that distance, that's not always the case with, relatives who are, several hours apart.
That's a good point. It's like working on a car together or building the doghouse or doing repairs at the home. That's usually what you do as a father and son, right? And so, yeah, that's a good point you bring up, is that, yeah, we're connecting, we are working on a project, we're deciding how do we want to frame our show, how do we connect with our listeners, what do we want to talk about as our main topics, and have we been too heavy on one topic and the other? Are we losing sight of who we are as the vision of our show? And so, yeah, it really is a truly works in progress type of thing, but we're always building it, and we're always the interesting part. And Dan, when you podcast with a friend, it's a lot different, because you can just sort of shoot from the hip and tell them what's going on, right? If you don't like their style, it's different when you're podcasting with family, right? You don't want to be too critical, you want to be sincere, but also if you think there's something that needs to be improved, we've had those conversations, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. But it's a very great dynamic. We enjoy it. And actually, when people like, you guys are father and son, I had no idea, and so that's kind of a cool little added, flavor that we have to this show. So yeah, it really is building and constructing something out of nothing, and sort of that's that project we get to work on week in and week out.
And from what I heard from Dave and Paul, I've been on their show, I've had Dave on my show a couple of times, and we've talked a lot about sort of the father-son podcasting. And what's interesting about it, I think, is that, and you sort of alluded to it from Jump Street when you talked about you guys started to hop on Skype to talk, and almost everyone, probably above the age of 20 can get their arms around this situation. It's very easy as you grow older and start to do things like get married, buy houses, do all those things to disconnect or pull back, or not necessarily have the same type of relationship with a family member that maybe you once did. But having that kind of mutual project together, this mutual goal of building something together, making it better, talking about topics, etc., ensures that connection, right? There's no way you could go 30 days without calling up your dad because life got so busy. No, we have an appointment every single week, you know what I mean? And so that in and of itself is a great benefit that can come from this.
It is. It's absolutely huge. Like you said, I mean, I can't go probably one day without texting my mom or my dad, because, I mean, we're talking about, hey, I got this great topic for the show. Let's research it. Or, hey, I got this idea for one of the other shows that I was listening to. So, yeah, it's this constant feedback, this constant construction project, basically, where, yeah, we're always improving. We're always looking, and we're always communicating. Like you said, we don't miss out on an opportunity to grow that relationship and foster that. And that's because every Monday at 5:00 we have an appointment together, and I think that's helped a lot, and podcasting with a family member, I think is such an amazing feat, because it's a bit of an intimate experience as well. You're in the room, you're podcasting, you're talking about a lot of different things, and you're sharing your thoughts about, there's plenty of times Steve and I have both disagreed on a podcast about something, and that's what the healthy part of the conversation happens, and that's where the relationship builds a little bit stronger. So,
and what's interesting is that just to kind of step out from your story just for a minute, and I know you've seen this because you monitor the podcast space probably even to a larger degree than I do, in that what we're seeing so much more of now. In fact, a recent sampler from Gimlet just talked about childish podcasting, and that was just their title, and they talked about a lot of kids, and I mean kids, getting into podcasting, right? I know Rob Walsh from Libsyn and Today in iOS son has a podcast, and then Sampler featured some as well. And what you're starting to see a lot now are sort of like parents and their 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds also have a podcast, and that's sort of like the extreme example of what you and your dad have going on now, and that's just people literally growing up with podcasting.
Yeah, it is. They're from birth. That's all they've known is on-demand audio and podcasting. And yeah, I recently heard of a girl up in Seattle who podcasts with her father. She's like 6 or 7 years old, and she's booking guests like the chief of police for the Seattle PD. She booked Rose Wetzel, who is a Spartan competitor for the Spartan races, that ultimate obstacle course marathon type stuff. And she is just nailing it with the guest, and it's crazy. I think the first time, probably about 3 years ago, was the very first time I heard about a 7-year-old podcasting. I'm like, that's amazing. At 7, I was falling off my bike and trying to put on rollerblades and couldn't do that. But yeah, it's incredible that this medium they're exposed to it at such a young age, and they're enjoying it. I even think I don't know if you've been seeing Nick Suberling, and he's big at least in the sports podcasting space, where he has his kids go on like Facebook Live and they record like YouTube videos, and they're in his studio and they are just naturals behind the mic and in front of the camera, and it's amazing to see. And I love to see this crop of youth that, the potential that goes into what they're going to add to the podcasting space now, but also in the future. It's really cool to be a part of.
I know we're going down a huge rabbit hole here, Dave, but you know what I was just thinking is that one of the thoughts I had when I started doing this was creating a catalog of hours of discussions, interviews, reference material, if you will, for my kids when they get older, or potentially grandkids, what have you, that could always look back on this. But taking that a step further, these kids who are getting into podcasting now, they're almost documenting their childhood in a way that a photo or even a home video wouldn't be able to do. These guys who are interviewing these people you were describing, like the young lady in Seattle, they're going to be able to look back on something and when they're in their 20s and point to something that not many of their peers have, and I think it's just awesome.
It is. That's impressive because, you can look at photos that you print, or you can look at photos that you save on your phone through Google Photos, Shutterfly, wherever you're saving it at. And there's 1,000 words that can be spoken about that picture. There's a certain memory that you're jogged to immediately, and you can share with your family and friends. But the ability to look back and listen to that audio, your voice of what you sounded like when you were 5 or 6 years old, and be able to retain that for 20, 30 more years and share that with your sons or your daughters, I think that's the amazing thing about podcasting. I know you were there when Kevin Smith was doing his keynote at Podcast Movement, and I felt this so much when he said it. He goes, I can't remember the sound of my grandmother's voice.
Right.
That's why I have my mom on my podcast, so when she does eventually pass, I have that memory, because that's the same way with my grandma. My grandma passed away 15 years ago. I don't remember what she sounds like, but given what the podcasting space and audio can do now, we can have a record of that, and having that voice and that timbre within your ears is something that can't be replaced. And so growing up through podcasting, I think it's amazing to think of what it's going to be like to listen back, 15, 20, 30 years.
And it works in every capacity, right? Even if it's friends and 20 years later going back, or husband and wife. There's so many husband and wife podcasts, same thing, and so many great stuff. But let me get back to the main track, because we could go off in these tangents for a while here. I want to get back a little bit more on Waves of Tech. You mentioned 300 plus episodes at this point. When you guys started, was this simply the concept of sort of like, hey, let's just put these conversations out there? Or even from Jump Street, did you sort of have goals of reaching an audience and setting up, segments? Or how did it start, and then how did it grow?
Yeah, it definitely was something that we all three enjoyed. I don't think my father and I, and also my brother Mike, who was a big part of it during the first 100 episodes, really thought we'd grow into what it is today. It wasn't something that we definitely envisioned being, as a Podcast Awards finalist for 3 straight years. That was something that came as a shock to us as we continued to develop and grow the show. For me personally, I was like, I've never been great behind a mic. Back in 2008, I was never great behind the computer. I didn't know a whole lot of technology. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll grow into this. And so I don't think at first I was fully invested in exactly what it meant, because I was simply behind the mic. My dad would have all the audio. He'd do everything. He'd post it, and I'd share it, and I listened to it. And I was like, okay, great. That's all I have to do. But once I really took it upon myself, like, this is something I'm passionate about. This is something I enjoy. It's something that I think I'm really good at talking about and sharing the word. That's when I really started to think, we can actually grow this into something. And as our show progressed, and as we got better and we had a lot more tools we could offer to other family members or other friends or people that were interested in getting into podcasting, that's when it really took off. Is like, okay, I think we can do a lot more with this. And that's the point where Steve really stepped up and said, I'm going to invest in some infrastructure and some new techniques and software and things like that. And I'm going to grow our show and add on a couple more shows to create a network of shows. And so I think it was the fuel that he was investing, the fuel that I was putting in there as well, that really sparked the interest in us continuing to grow this. So, it's I think that answers the question. It's one of those things where, yeah, the segments change. I didn't like how this went, so we'll modify it. Those things, I think we've really settled on a very simple format. It works. It's easy. Instead of trying to get too convoluted, it's almost like sometimes us podcasters can try and overproduce and overthink our content. It's like, do what you're good behind the mic. If you're good at analysis, great. If you need breaks, you need all these other things, great, go for it as well. But I think it's one of those things, once I found my voice and once I found my comfort level, that's really when I started to invest heavily and really take it seriously. And it showed over, the last 300 plus episodes where, each show is a very consistent fashion. We're regular on the release, and, it's something, with tech news, there's something new every week. So we're never going to run out of content, right? Just like you. There's always going to be a podcaster out there that you're going to want to interview. It's just about locking them into a time and date and getting it. So, we can talk about everything from Apple and Microsoft to all the social media platforms. We can talk about, the technology behind the educational space and the aerospace and aeronautics and what all that means to you and what impacts, what Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, what are they doing and how does that influence you as a user? Those are all the things we talk about. And so it's kind of nice to be in a space where it's like almost a self-generated product and we simply go out there and give our opinions about it. And I think that also helped is the more I dove into the knowledge in some of these businesses, the more opinionated I get. And I think that made my passion a little bit more heightened. And so I was able to just continue to crank out show after show just by having that passion within me.
All right. So before we jump into International Podcast Day, with now all these episodes underneath, and people know we're recording in September of 2016. Bigger story this month, Dave. No headphone jack on iPhone 7 Plus or Galaxy Note 7 explosions.
Oh, man. Galaxy Note 7 explosions we have talked about on our last 2 episodes. I think we're going to give it a break for next week. But, yeah, it's causing some significant downward spiral for Samsung right now. I think they've lost close to 20% of their market share. That's over like $14.4 billion in a couple weeks. Even the FAA has said, please don't bring and or charge Samsung Galaxy Notes onto the planes. We've heard of Jeeps burning down. We've heard of hotel rooms catching fire. We've heard of a bunch of different things. It's a very unfortunate situation considering the timing with the iPhone 7 and 7S that has come out. Samsung, the largest cell phone manufacturer out there, they're definitely going on the right trend. And something like this is going to be a major setback with them. In the whole iPhone 7, 7S with the Bluetooth without the headphone jack, oh man, it is causing some ruckus out there.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people that are very upset, and a lot of people are like, I'll just get the little dongle attachment, it'll be fine, But it's one of those things where, Apple does what it does because people are going to follow it, right? And if you're absorbed and you're into the ecosystem of Apple, it's no different if you're in the ecosystem of Android. You're going to live and breathe in that, and basically whatever happens based on those companies' decisions, those long-term plans, that's what you're going to have to be forced to move to. And the wireless headphones, that's nothing new. That's something we've seen, and it's something that's going to be the future. Not sure if that's an inconvenience for a lot of us or a nuisance. You do have to worry about connectivity and battery and all that other stuff. It's something else you add to it. But it's one of those things where the industry moves, and oftentimes we don't have the say as a consumer where it goes, because these companies have the capital and the vision. And so it's a very interesting take, and we talk about all those different things on our podcast. It's
been an exciting month. I think I've told you this before, and longtime listeners of the show know that I am a huge tech aficionado, like ridiculously. In fact, my brother and I had a 30-minute conversation on the phone last night regarding the Note 7 stuff. I will be at my local Apple store 8 a.m. picking up the iPhone 7 Plus. So I am one of those junkies in terms of technology. And, there's so many interesting questions out there with both those particular stories. And one of the ones that I think is very likely is I don't think we will ever see another Galaxy Note. And not that I mean that I don't think they will make one with a stylus, large screen, etc., but I think that name is over. I don't think that they will ever be able to sell that brand name again. I think it's too diluted, it's too tarnished, and I think at this point they're going to rebrand it with something else and try to start over.
I totally concur with that. I've even heard some reports that they were going to change simply just the new phones to a Galaxy Note 8. I don't even think that's good enough. There's some things within the podcasting or the tech space when you think about BlackBerry or Gateway or those things where you don't dare put one of those names with that because there's a bad history, there's a bad association with that, and they're going to have to remove themselves from the Note name and move on and come up with something else.
And maybe the Galaxy name. Maybe.
That's a good point too. You may just have to completely
just rebrand
strip away that entire namesake and go with what you know.
And if they partner it with we're redoubling our safety efforts and here's our new flagship title in early 2017 when the Galaxy S8 would typically come out, if they just get rid of Galaxy, rebrand it, start fresh, I think people will give them another chance. Change the marketing, change it, and just start again. But I think they'd be smart to bury Note for sure, but maybe even the Galaxy line. So.
I don't blame you, because I do like your logic there, because 2.5 million phones have been that have been sold and are going to be returned or are returned. That's a hard thing to get over, and we do know that even though we do have short attention spans, big stories like this stay in our minds for a long time, and so I would agree with you that move to something else is probably inevitable.
I think that'd be smart to do that.
Yeah.
Well, we're going down another rabbit hole because things like podcasting and technology are like two prime areas for me to start going down rabbit holes. So
there's so many different tangents we can go. It's all good.
Let's get on to the main event, shall we? International Podcast Day. This is year 3, September 30th, folks. Mark it on your calendar. It's a big deal and getting bigger each and every year. But Dave, let's start at the very beginning. How did this idea, and I guess maybe it was your dad's first, but how did this idea gestate, and what were the early conversations on how this all got started?
Yeah, I love the story behind how International Podcast Day got started, because Steve, my dad, the guy I podcast with, he founded that network. He was driving around, and to this day, he goes, I don't know why I wasn't listening to a podcast. I was listening to the radio, which is very uncommon. He always has a podcast download in his player, but he heard a commercial on the radio for National Senior Citizens Day. He's just driving down the street in his hometown, and he goes,
didn't know about
why the heck? Yeah, why the heck do we not have a day for podcasters and podcasting in the podcast space? So he rang me the next day. It was like, hey, I had this crazy idea. I'm like, hey, shoot it. He goes, National Podcast Day. I'm like, where are you going with this? He goes, there's National, French Fry Day. There's National Senior Citizens Day. There's National Best Friends Day. You can pick any day. There's everything. And he goes, let's do something. Let's figure this out. I'm like, I really like where you're going with this. So Steve actually went out to Podcast Movement in 2014 in Dallas and started spreading the word a little bit. That was in July. And then we were planning September 2014 to be our first year of celebration. And the reason we chose September is because September 2004 is actually the birth date of podcasting. That's really when it was initially launched and everything was born. And so this was sort of like a 10-year anniversary celebration of that event. And so we said, hey, let's, instead of doing the third Saturday or the fourth Friday or whatever, let's just make it September 30th, year in and year out. And so that's how it was born. And in 2014, we only did, I think, 6 hours of streaming, and it was just national at that time. So we just did things in the United States. And, myself, Steve, Daniel J. Lewis, Ray Ortega, Dave Jackson, Nick Suberling, Paul Culligan, a couple of those guys, we got on board and we did, a couple YouTube videos, and we did a Google Hangout, and, very simple, but we really enjoyed it. And so not long after that, probably during the event, we heard, well, podcasting just isn't national. It's not necessarily just US only. It's in the UK, it's in Australia. And that was our wake-up call to be like, it truly is an international thing, because even the show, The Waves of Tech, that we do has been downloaded in several countries. And so we immediately did that rebrand, as we just talked about, and moved directly into International Podcast Day. And 2015 was ridiculous. From going from only 6 hours in 2014 to utilizing Blab at the time, rest in peace, and to go to straight 33 plus hours of live streaming utilizing Blab. And we represented 11 different countries, including like Poland, Finland, Argentina, Spain, Germany, UK, United States, Canada. We had someone from Argentina. We had some people from Australia. I know I'm missing a country, but we had over 11 countries represented from 60 podcasters on that stream. We jumped into having over, I think, 45,000 mentions using hashtag podcast day. iTunes tweeted us about it. Wait, Don't Tell Me tweeted about it. CBS, ESPN, there was so much just traction and so much momentum there. And it was just a matter of 1 year.
Right.
And so that's really the birth and how we grew into International Podcast Day. And it's something that's been really embraced.
Let me go back. That you just covered 12 months in that answer. Let me go back to the beginning, because what I'm really curious was the original vision. Your dad gives you this call based on this radio ad he heard, and you are intrigued by the idea. In those first couple of weeks or first 30 days or so, what were you guys thinking of putting together? What was the sort of, was it like, oh, we'll just start a hashtag, or we'll pick a date, or, when did it start? Like, what was the original vision? You mentioned 6 hours of podcasting in that first day. Was the idea just bring podcasters in, or sort of, what were those first few conversations before the first one?
Yeah, going back a couple years, it's hard to remember all those conversations. I'm getting up there in age, Dan.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? But yeah, the original intent was just to provide an outlet for people to join and discuss the power of podcasting. At that time, we didn't know how big it was going to be, how we would have to rebrand. And it was, what can we do with the tools that we have out there right now to gather in podcasters? So we did the Google Hangouts where Daniel J. Lewis did a little question and answer. And at that time, it was really, let's provide some sort of live stream broadcast that provides podcasters with a free open venue to learn about podcasting, how to improve their process, what questions you have, what experts in the field can provide those answers for you. And that's really how it started, was simply, let's put a day out there where everybody can do what they want and celebrate accordingly, but let's provide an additional resource so people didn't have to travel to the conferences or travel to the meetups. And, let's just be an outlet for all these podcasters out there. And that's really what it came to. And to be honest, the whole 6 hour block, that just sort of grew organically. Like when Steve and I hit Let's Go Live, we had 4 of us on a channel, and we're just sort of talking about our favorite shows and, calling people in via Skype and having them talk about their podcast. It was really informal at that time. And, Daniel J. Lewis said, hey, I'll do a question and answer. And so it sort of grew into this, what can we do as the resource end to provide these podcasters. So that's kind of the idea. I don't necessarily know, Dan, if we had like what we originally wanted to do in 2014. You mentioned
Daniel, Dave Jackson, right? Ray Ortega, right? Was Nick a part of it at that point?
Yes, he was.
So how did you even get those guys involved? Were they sort of people you'd already made contact with, and they were interested in the idea as well, or did you reach out with the idea? How'd that process go?
Yeah, that was basically Steve. As he was growing his podcast network, he was also corresponding with Ray and Daniel and Dave and Nick on just different things, running the network, producing good audio, what kind of tips and tricks. And so like internally, that was their little the Fab Five that we're trying to improve everything that they're doing. And so I was at that time just sort of on the outskirts. I hadn't really known these guys. I hadn't listened to too many of their podcasts. I was aware of them. I know who they were simply just because of their name. And so that was really Steve's working and getting them on board, because I think originally, to be honest, if it was just me and Steve behind a mic calling ourselves National Podcast Day, I don't think it would have gone anywhere, right? And so we teamed up with some of the big names in the industry. We know that each podcaster holds their own weight. They have their own listening base and their audience and their followers. And that is exactly what we wanted to do, is to at least team up with everybody else to make this day a success. And then we can move forward from there.
And most of these guys that you originally had in year one, the names we just mentioned, these are, if you would say, podcast vets, right? Podcasts, most Absolutely. Of them are sort of podcasts about podcasts, talk a lot of strategy, audience growth, hardware, software, tips and tricks, those type of folks. These were sort of the insiders of the insiders, if you will. These were kind of the folks people start out going to kind of get started or grow their show. Is that a fair sort of summary?
That is perfect. Yes.
Right. Yep. But many of them have shows outside of that genre as well. And that and by the way, as an aside, I love probably those efforts a little bit more than their own ones. You know what I mean? Like when Dave Jackson shows up on the feed, or when with Ray's YouTube videos, which I think are just phenomenal, or Podcasters Roundtable, those type of things. When they kind of step out of that kind of coach role, I think is when they're spectacular. I wish each one of them would have like non-podcast related shows, because I think they're awesome people, and they're great talkers, and they have great production quality, and
absolutely,
that's just one thing. But that was for year one. So the day after, October 1st, 2014, take me back to that day. Looking back, what was the mindset?
The mindset was, I'm really surprised that went as good as it did. Like, we got, I'm totally serious here. Right. Steve and I got on the phone. Actually, we went out to dinner that night to celebrate with my wife and my mother. And it was, let's have a beer, let's have a margarita, let's do whatever, because that was a total success. And then we sit back the next day and be like, I really think after all the positive email and responses and text and Facebook and tweets and all that stuff, it was like, this could be something much bigger than what we planned. And that was the moment where we sat back and was like, okay, let's look at the international scale, because people are wanting that. And that's the beauty of this podcast day thing, Dan, is that we simply put it out there, and the space absolutely soaked it up. And it was like, okay, this is something that people want. And so not only was it us wanting to spread the word of podcasting, get podcast listening enthusiasts on board, connect other podcasters with the resources to make them successful, the entire community wanted it. And I think so my passion plus their passion was an easy outlet, a good synergy in order to move it forward. And so that was October 1st, 2014 was really a game changer, because it really put something that was very simple for us to plan and manage, and really thrust us into this new, now we are planning a full-blown conference. And that's sort of what Podcast Day is, right? I mean, we have 30 plus hours, and we're coordinating 30 plus guests with sponsorships and running the website and all the Twitter accounts and Facebook feeds throughout the year. And so this grew into something much quicker than we actually anticipated. And so we've had some lessons learned. We've had those hard conversations of where we want to go. And so October 1st, 2014 was really the game changer for us, when we said, you know what, if we're in it, we're in it, that's exactly what we've done. There was some validation, right? There was some there's something here. Let's go forward. Yeah, you never quite know when you throw something out. I mean, everybody's probably had a podcast that has only made it 10, 15, 20 episodes. You never get a review, you never get any comments, and then you're done. That was sort of the fear going into National Podcast Day, was like, what if people don't respond? If they don't respond, maybe we'll consider doing something next year. Maybe we'll can it. Maybe someone will create a better podcast day than we did. But as you mentioned, once we had that validation of this is something that people enjoyed, that they want to take part of, and they're given the freedom to do whatever they want without leaving the comfort of their home, they can do a lot of things on podcast day. That was sort of the reason for us to continue to move forward. So yeah, having that validation was probably one of the biggest keys to make us move forward. And what's happened over the last 2 years, and this is not, and I want to be clear about this, not to be diminutive or denigrate you or the group's effort in any way, but now, since it got in sort of September 30th, 2014 as that first day, now International Podcast Day, rebranded International Podcast Day, is now able to ride the same wave that podcasting in and of itself is doing as well. Right. So absolutely, as all the big shows and the big networks and the big players start to come, the audiences start to grow, you guys are in there. It's a recognized name. And as that growth is just naturally occurring, International Podcast Day itself is growing. So between years one and years two, you alluded to it earlier in your answer, but
What conversations did you and Steve start to have about, putting aside the international, I think we got that piece, but besides making it broader and representative of more than just the U.S., what were some of the ideas and conversations like about how do we do this better in year 2?
Yeah, it was interesting because, when you go to year 2 and we already have that vision of, okay, we're looking globally, we're looking internationally here. What do we need to make this thing sustainable, right? Because I think that's ultimately what people want to do. I mean, yes, podcasting, it's a money pit sometimes if you're doing it as a hobby. And a lot of the things we had planned for 2015 needed the resources. Yes, we could pay out of pocket. We could do some other things. We could team up with other experts in the field. But that's when we really turn the page and say, hey, this is something people want to talk about. This is something people want to celebrate. Let's consider the idea of sponsorships, and we'll provide them with hours on our stream, and we'll provide them with a lot of social media shout outs, and we can connect with them when we meet them in person. And so sustainability was absolutely one thing. We have to run the website. We have to, pay for all the plugins. We have to, pay for all the time we do corresponding, emailing, traveling to podcast movement, traveling to meetups that I've gone to in San Diego and different places. Those were all the sort of things that started kind of turning in our heads. Was like, okay, we really need to push the word on this, and no better way than word of mouth is to spread that, And so that was one of the big things we thought is, how do we make this sustainable year after year? And then next we said, we did our little piddly 6 hours, we considered it a success, but who do we need to get on board next year to really give it that flavor, right? Who do we need to talk to? And so we started talking to Rob Greenlee with Spreaker, and we started talking to like UK podcasters, New Media Expo Europe with Isabella and Mike Russell. Those were sort of the connections we needed to make in order to really bridge that gap between the United States and everyone else. And, that's one of the things, Dan, is when you plan something like this, you often sort of get tunnel vision when you're doing this. You're like, I know this person, I'm going to invite them. I know exactly where I want to go. But that's when you have to work as a team and take the initiative and take some advice from other people and sort of detach yourself away from this and say, how can we improve this to the best of our ability without our narrow mindset here? So we invited a lot of different, as I mentioned, countries and men and women, a lot of different personalities onto that stream. And so that was, I know that's a long answer, but that's sort of what was going through our mind at that time.
Well, now the next question has to be, how did you feel on October 1st, 2015?
Tired.
30 hours, right?
Yeah, because what we did is, technically we started International Podcast Day, since I'm here in California. We started on Thursday the 29th at 3 p.m. because that is 8 a.m. New Zealand time,
right,
which is Podcast Day, September 30th.
It's like a crazy version of New Year's Eve. Podcast
it is.
Style.
That's a great way. I've never thought about that. Yeah, you celebrate Podcast Day, then I'll celebrate it, and then you can do it, and then you can do it. Yeah, we did the whole west to east type movement on it. And 2015 was amazing. As I mentioned, 33 plus straight hours. Steve and I were individually, we were awake for the entire thing. I think I stayed up till about 5 a.m. that first day. Steve woke up, took the stream for about 4 hours. But it was amazing because we were able to sit back in Steve's studio and moderate it and enjoy the feedback and really just take in all the podcasters that were on the stream, bringing in their audiences and sharing their stories of how podcasting has changed their life or the growth of podcasting in Argentina and Spain. And those were all amazing things to listen to. We had streams that were in German, that were in Spanish, things that we couldn't understand that I was like, this is amazing anyways. It was a great feeling. I do say tired, a bit sarcastically, but it was a lot of work. But it was an amazing feeling to sit back and just see something that was birthed only 12 months prior into growing into something like this. And first and foremost, thanks to the podcasting community and the podcast listening space for really latching onto this and really growing it organically, because Steve and I can only do so much, right? There's only so much two people can do to promote a cause. And once sort of that ball gets rolling, once that grass fire starts, it continues to spread. And that's really, again, it was almost like double validation, right?
Right.
It just felt like this is exactly what we need to be doing. And so many people were already asking October 1st, what are you guys doing for next year? What's going to happen for next year? And so it's like, there's no time to really step back and pump the brakes, right? It's you reflect, you sit back, kind of debrief a little bit, but then it's on to the next stages.
And before we get to this upcoming one, a little off-kilter question from a different angle. There, of course, with the effort, the time, the people, the construction of the programs, the execution, the reflection, there were regrets, I'm sure. Things that you wish maybe you would have done differently, or rephrased, lessons learned. Looking back at the first 2 years before we get into what folks can expect this week, what are some of the things that you took away as learned lessons?
Yeah, lessons learned is it's a lot of self-reflection. It's a lot of honesty with yourself. I even reached out to a couple of my friends right after the event. And I was like, hey, I know we're good friends. You're a podcaster. Tell me what you thought. Like, honestly, right? And so one of the things that I critiqued myself about, and you can see it as you mentioned the growth of podcasting within the last 2 years with all the larger networks and some of the, the radio stations getting on board, is that I didn't create an event that was diverse enough, in my opinion, of the podcasting space. I was way too heavy on having males on there. I was way too heavy with some of the topics, because I was sort of in my tunnel, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. This year, it's about celebrating that diversity of podcasting, both internationally and domestically. And so that was one of the real lessons learned is like, we have to create an event that's reflective of the podcasting space. And I think we're doing ourselves, our cause, the industry, its own disservice if we don't consider that. And diversity is a huge topic. It's both controversial and celebrated at the same time. And that's something that I've personally taken onto my shoulders to make sure something like that happens with our event. We've seen it at other podcasting conferences. So we want to be really reflective of the space. And that was a real big thing. Trying to think of some of the other lessons learned. I mean, internally, Steve and I really found things that didn't work and that really did work. The complicated nature of working with 33 different podcasters across, potentially 20 different time zones is very difficult. What happens if somebody bows out at the last minute, or we have a major player that comes in that wants to be a part of the event? How do we adjust from there? I've learned a lot of ways how to reach out to podcasters. Some people want the DMs on Twitter. Some people want the lengthy email. Some people want to jump on Skype to talk about it. So the lesson learned there is you have to be flexible. You have to be understanding of everybody that wants to be a part of your cause, right? That's tailoring your conversation with them, catering to what they need. And if you have to hop on Skype for an hour to talk about the event and, really make clear what you want to do and where they're going with, so be it. That's something that as a responsibility I feel to do. So those were a couple lessons learned, and those things we're definitely applying here in 2016.
I have a question for you because I think those are both very valid. I mean, obviously, the expansion to international is a big deal and a good move, as well as a focus this upcoming year on diversity because, like you say, it is a hot topic and something that I think needs as much attention as it can possibly be given to right the ship in ways that it's not currently. So, but here's a question I've been sitting here thinking about for the last 20 minutes or so that we've been chatting, Dave. And one of the things I wonder about International Podcast Day, when we talk about the space, I wonder what your thoughts are on, is it too echo chambery? Right? Are we all sort of celebrating ourselves at some point? How do we, in your view, spread beyond the walls of the existing listenership and the existing podcasters, right? You mentioned last year about how it got picked up by a number of mass media outlets. That's huge. And I imagine so many people got exposed to that hashtag that never would have before. In that, along those lines, what are some things that you think could be done moving forward?
Yeah, that's a very deep question that I think that a lot of us need to have that answer, because you're right. We can get to an extent self-absorbed, into a respect where we're celebrating ourselves. And that's another thing that I learned from last year is it's great to provide resources to podcasters to make them successful, connect them with the tools and the talent to grow their audience, to market themselves. But it's also about branching out and reaching the podcast listener, because they are truly the ones that are making the space successful. And it's not necessarily us. Yeah, we provide the technology and the medium and the audio source and the production and the creation to do so, but we also can't forget those that are making it successful. And so when you look at that, it's how do you incorporate that? How do you work outside of your own frame of mind in your own box to really focus in on the attention that the listener and the audience deserves? And it's a very difficult question to answer. I don't have all the tools or all the answers to do so. There's certain things that we can do on our end to improve that. And try to invite some of the podcast listening enthusiasts to be a part of the stream, to share their favorite podcast with everybody. I think a lot of times, Dan, we have to step outside of just our usual role as a producer, as a content creator, and just talk one-on-one with somebody in our office about the power of podcasting. What are you interested in? Hey, let me share this show with you. Because that's, I think, really when you can break down those barriers. Yeah, you may be a podcaster, but it doesn't mean you have to be so absorbed in talking about podcasting that you shouldn't be able to connect with the general, interested party. And so I think those are a couple things that we can do. What are your thoughts on where we can go?
Well, the very first thought is we just need to get you interviewed by Jimmy Fallon on the Tonight Show.
That would be
really
great.
Exactly.
Yes. I mean,
what we need.
Mark Maron's been on there, and who else has been on there? But yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's what I'm getting at, right? That's sort of what I'm thinking of, is that I know what I do, right? And what I do is, if you're a podcast listener, come here and I'm going to tell you about a bunch of great stuff and show you behind the scenes of that great stuff. But what I'm not doing, and what I don't know how to do, is how do I break down that wall, right? We've all had that conversation with the stranger or the cousin you haven't seen in 2 years, or, the longtime friend you haven't spoke to in 5 years, and they say, oh, you're into podcasting. What's that? Right? What is a podcast? That whole conversation. How do we bring those people in, right? Because those people know what Sirius and XM radio are. They may not have it in their car, but they know what it is. So how do we raise the brand awareness to the point that, Serial started it, right? How do the rest of us, and maybe International Podcast Day, finish that message, right? Bringing people over to, because the producers that are here and the hosts that are here, great. I'm one of them. The listeners that are here and the people who are supporting the shows, great. I'm one of them. But what about, all the rest of the potential audience that's out there? How do we get them to become aware of the awesome things happening here, right? So,
yeah,
you on the Tonight Show or you on Good Morning America would be great. But short of that.
Right. I think one of the key things, and this is a very interesting dynamic of podcasting that we've always heard, that I think as listeners we pigeonhole ourselves in. Podcasting by nature is a little bit intimate, right? We listen to it in our cars by ourselves on the ride to and from work. We listen to it at our offices with our headphones in. People walk by, they see we're listening to something. Oh, sorry to interrupt. We pause it, move on, whatever. I think that plays into us not sharing the news of what we're listening to. People go, oh, sorry to interrupt your music. Right. That is a great chance to say, oh, I'm listening to a podcast. That happened 2 days ago to me. They're like, podcast? What are you listening to? And come to find out, this person has been listening to podcasts for like last 5-6 years. And really kind of like our tagline with International Podcast Day is start the conversation. Don't be afraid to branch out and say, if you're talking about Universal Studios that you just went to, or Disney World, or Magic Mountain, or you just took a trip, to New York City or Salt Lake City, wherever it is, that's your opportunity to interject some podcasting into it, and be like, hey, man, if you're a big fan of Disney, you got to check out one of these shows. Or if you go to Salt Lake, you got to check out I Am Salt Lake. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities to inject something about the power of what that we know is in our hands, but it's being comfortable enough to just say that, right? Because by nature, what I'm getting at is podcast is intimate. Therefore, we sort of keep it close to our chest, and we keep it close to our ears and our heart. And often it's like you don't want to share that. I went to a podcast listening party 2 weeks ago, first one we've ever had in Bakersfield, and it was amazing. We listened to Criminal, The Finger. I forget exactly which episode that was, maybe 18 or so, but it was an amazing experience to be a part of. Close to 30 people from our hometown that was sitting there listening to an 18-minute segment and just talking about podcast and the story. And I think that's really where the organic growth and where we move beyond just who we are as podcasters into that space. So it's about sharing that message as thoroughly as you can, because if you're a big football fan or a soccer fan or, a big fan of a TV show, you want to tell everybody, right, Dan? Mm-hmm. And so if you're a big fan of a podcast, people don't always share that because there's something almost awkward about telling people still. I don't get that way because that's sort of what we do with Podcast Day is we want to share that message. I tell everybody at work about it, but it's just sort of branching outside of that comfort zone and saying, hey, check this out. And I know that sounds easier than it is for a lot of people, but I think that really goes a very long way in promoting the space.
Opinion. Do you think podcasts in the mass general audience has a stigma from older talk radio attached to it?
I do. I really do because
I think people hear the word podcast and they think talk radio, and they think about when they grew up and their mother used to listen to AM radio and they hated it because they couldn't listen to their radio station. And it's so different, right? We all know this. Everyone listening to my voice right now knows it's a completely different animal. But I'm wondering, from the broader masses, is that a stigma it's carrying with it?
How long was podcasting described as like internet radio?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, at the time it was internet radio. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But that was like, a lot of people say, well, it's a podcast. Oh, it's like internet radio. And it's like, that is a very bad description of podcasting, right? Just like where it's at right now. And I think once again, like we talked about earlier, you attach a different name like radio to it. You think of 7-minute segments, commercial, weather, news, blah, 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 and I still listen to radio. I think radio has some tremendous value that podcasters can grab a hold of. And I've listened to one of my friends, Shannon Hernandez out of Phoenix. He's a radio DJ. He's also a podcaster. Amazing guy to talk to about how radio can influence podcasting. But I think you're at the point where, yes, you think of it's just a bunch of talking heads. They're the shock jock value, and it's just a bunch of nonsense being spitted out at the radio, like you said, with AM or FM radio. And I think there is a bit of that. I think people are learning the beauty of on-demand audio. You can pause it. You can come back to it. If you miss some news on a sports station you're listening to, well, you got to find it online somehow now. You just can't replay Dan Patrick's show unless you download their podcast. And so I think once you start sharing the benefits of what podcasting can add to your lifestyle, I think that's another way where we can really branch out and sort of break down those barriers. So I would agree. I think there's a bit of hesitancy from some newer listeners coming in being like, I don't know about this whole podcast thing. It just sounds like, radio. And that's our opportunity to kind of change the conversation and change the way they think about it.
Yeah. And for my 2 cents, for what it's worth, Dave, I mean, I think that's one of the most beautiful things potentially that Podcast Day can do, because you guys have rallied so many networks, people, influential podcasters, listeners, audiences, the mentions in social media so much, is that it can raise that awareness and get people to see, that this is happening, and here's all the people that are partaking, and look at all these people, people who never listen to a podcast may follow somebody on their Facebook or social or Twitter channel come the 30th and see that hashtag and figure it out. And to me, that's more important than anything else. And that's just my take. Just this one little podcaster here, just my take. Bringing it to, the mainstream, I think, is one of the biggest things. But
yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we always talk about is, we're dedicated to promoting podcasting worldwide, and that's through public engagement that we just talked about, and also education. And our educational component is using hashtag Podcast Day and sharing that, because everybody probably knows everybody or somebody that listens to a podcast. It's just about finding that little nugget, and that may happen on September 30th for somebody, and they could become the biggest podcast enthusiast there is. So yeah, that's definitely a dimension that I think we bring, and thanks to guys like you, it really helps. I mean, Steve and I were on a conference call, I think this Sunday morning, with somebody out in Florida. And so we were talking to them about Podcast Day, and he goes, yeah, I called up some of my buddies and said, hey, do you know what International Podcast Day is? He goes, yeah. He goes, do you know anything about the guys? Oh, the guys are nice. They're great. Whatever. I haven't met them, but I kind of know who they are. And that was sort of like, took me back a little bit. I'm like, hey, people are talking about this. So podcasters are talking about this, so people that have heard about the event are also either researching it, considering it, talking to their other friends about podcasting. So it's interesting because you don't always have to hear or feel or see that validation. It's probably going on subsurface that we're never going to hear about, and sometimes that's probably, as you mentioned, some of the best things that are happening right now.
Well, wait till you and Steve sit down with Fallon. I'm telling you, everybody's going to know who you.
It's going to be big.
Let's wrap this up. Let's tell folks coming on the 30th, what can they see? What will they be able to experience? What can they learn or watch or read come the 30th, and what can they do to be a part of it?
Absolutely, yeah. So first things first, head over to internationalpodcastday.com. We have so many different things. We are putting together currently our schedule of 35 straight hours of podcasting. Again, we will go from Australia all the way over to Hawaii, and we'll end the thing over there. Straight celebration of all things podcasting. It's going to be great. Over there on Podcast Day, we have tons of suggestions on how you can actually get involved. Obviously, the big one is use hashtag Podcast Day to spread the word, share the news. A lot of other things, Dan, that everybody can do. You can actually join in or create a meetup locally. I know here in Bakersfield, I told somebody about Podcast Day yesterday, and they're actually going to plan a meetup for Podcast Day. You can actually promote the event by using any of our banner images or promotional material on your website. We have like an audio promo you can infuse into your podcast as well. One of the great things is that you can just start, as we mentioned, explaining what a podcast is to somebody and get them hooked. As a podcast listener, you can always share your podcast, your favorite one, with a friend, coworker, teammate, whatever it is. But I think this is one of the best things. If you haven't been to iTunes Store and rated and review your favorite shows, that's a really good way to just simply get involved with the event. And while you're over there, you're probably going to discover a new podcast. But those are some things like individually you can do. Collectively, what we're going to do on the site is we're going to have a lot of tutorials, a lot of sessions on creating a good podcast. We're going to have a couple sponsors on there talking about their products that they're going to be offering. It's really interesting because we're going to have over in Australia, I'm not sure if you heard about this, Dan, they're having OzPod 2016, which is a full day celebrating podcasting in Australia. And I think it's ABC Radio that's out there that is planning all this. They have some amazing keynotes, and it's going to be a live conference basically for the day. And so they're doing that. We're going to team up with them, and we're going to have 3 hours dedicated to our stream from Australia so we can see what they're doing over there. Some cool things I've heard randomly of people, they're going to do a Podcast Day pub crawl. And so they're going to be, that's what I'm talking about, right? And it was like
one in every city. Let's make it happen.
One in every city, and then get behind the mic and record your episode after that to celebrate. That's going to be really cool. I've heard some people that are doing a Podcast Day happy hour where they've scheduled some stand-up comedians to come in, and they're going to have they're selling tickets. They're going to be like 4 hours of comedy, and they're going to talk about podcasting. So there's so many things to look forward to, and that's what Steve and I have always encouraged as founder, co-founder, is if you take part in our stream, awesome, we appreciate it. But ultimately, Podcast Day is about making the day yours. What are you going to do to celebrate podcasting? As a podcaster, you can release your new show. You can launch a new show on Podcast Day. You can give away mugs and T-shirts and books and all these different things. You can invite listeners onto your show. But as a listener, you can do a bunch of other things. As I mentioned, you can join the meetups. You can rate and review. You can join the conversation. We're going to have our live stream over at firetalk.com. There's going to be a chat room there for everybody to come in and join and be a part of that 33-hour stream. So I know that's a lot to take in right now, but really it's just getting in to the bowels of podcasting and connecting with people and sharing the great news and the power of podcasting. So whether you're a podcaster, a listener, you like to be out in front of the crowd behind the mic or at your desk, it's all about doing what you want to do on Podcast Day. As long as we continue to spread the word and the benefits and the power of podcasting, that's really all we're looking forward to.
Well, and I'm going to add in just one bit, and I'm going to ask you for all the links and stuff for folks in a second, but let me put it this way, folks. What you need to do is to make sure you're following INTL Podcast Day on Twitter, right? I know, Dave, you pretty much run this account. It has been around a while, joined August 2014, which is interesting because that's the same month that I launched this show. And from September 1st, technically. But Dave and that account have been wildly supportive of this show. It will be wildly supportive of your show. If you are not following it to see what's going on in the podcast world, to stay abreast of all things Podcast Day, you're not doing podcasting right, okay? As of the moment of this recording, which is not the time you're hearing this, folks, I see 4,600 followers for International Podcast Day. That's wrong, okay? If you're a podcaster, follow International Podcast Day, INTL Podcast Day, link in show notes, folks. And that's one of the best ways to stay abreast of everything happening all year long with International Podcast Day. And so I'll just add that onto everything you just said. But
perfect. Thank you. Because it's amazing. What I do there is like you mentioned, I'm very proud of your show. I enjoy listening to it. I like to share the news. It connects me with new podcasts and allows other listeners to enjoy it. But that's really what it is. I mean, ultimately, yeah, we have a day, but it's really a year-long venture to celebrate those milestones of a new podcast launch. Hitting episode 100 if that's your milestone, episode 50, episode 300, whatever it is. If you received your first rating and review, please tell us about it, because that is a reason to celebrate, and that's really what we want to do. Yeah, we're going to share, the ins and outs of podcasting and the drama that is, CPM and downloads and all that stuff. We're going to provide all that information via that Twitter feed, but we also want to hear from you as podcasters and listeners as well. What are you listening to? What are you celebrating? And that's really what it's about. So I appreciate those kind words. And that's, again, I'm just the outlet. I'm just the resource to get these words out there. And the community is really soaking it in. And again, some more validation from that side. So that's always good to hear.
So tell them, Dave, somebody out there wants to hear Waves of Tech. Check out Modern Life Podcast Network, or most importantly, get in on International Podcast Day. How do they do it?
Yeah, absolutely. If you guys are interested in the Waves of Tech, I guess I should have said it's like a tech variety show, tech grab bag, as I like to call it. We talk about all things tech. You can head over to modernlifepodcastnetwork.com to check out that show. Also, we have a ton of great shows over there. I think there's 10 on the network talking about women's issues, cultural, current events, business, social solutions. There's a lot of different cool podcasts out there that you may be interested. So that was modernlifepodcastnetwork.com. And as you mentioned, internationalpodcastday.com is the place to be for all things podcasting coming September 30th. We have links to our live stream that we're going to be doing. We have merchandise that's available, links if you're interested in a gratitude award to hear what we're doing with that. There's all sorts of – there's a pop quiz, like a Podcast Day pop quiz. There's all sorts of resources for podcast listeners and podcasters themselves. So really the one hub is internationalpodcastday.com. But yeah, definitely connect on the Twitter with me, and I'd love to have a conversation with everybody.
I will be wearing my International Podcast Day shirt that I got sometime between year 1 and 2, and I still wear to this day. I'm not even joking. It is casual wear. I do have to say that. It is. I often will put it on in the morning when I take the dogs out and all that fun. But I do
you're
wear
spreading
it
the word.
Regularly,
that's what you're doing
all the time, and I will have it on 9:30. So yes, folks, if this is the first time you're hearing about all this, please check it out. Dave and his dad do wonderful work, and International Podcast Day is a big deal, and it's going to be an even bigger deal this year. So Dave Lee, thank you very much for taking the time to join me, my friend.
I appreciate it, Dan. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.